Let's kill her and take the house.
I can't wait to take her place as your wife.
She made their coffee every morning. Warm, strong, just the way they liked it. She set the mugs on the counter, poured the cream, wiped down the surface, and went about getting her daughter ready for school, the same way she had done every single morning for the past 6 months. She didn't think about the coffee after that. She had too much to do, too many people depending on her, too many things she was holding together with both hands. She didn't think about the coffee, but she should have, because for 6 months, the people living under her roof, eating at her table, sleeping in her house, had been slowly poisoning it. And her 7-year-old daughter Rose was drinking it too. This is not a story about a woman who didn't see the signs. This is a story about a woman who was too busy loving people who didn't deserve it to imagine they were capable of what they were planning. Sarah had built everything around her from nothing: the house, the savings, the investments, the life. And 2 people who had never built anything on their own decided they wanted it. They wanted all of it. And they decided that the fastest way to get it was to make sure Sarah wasn't around to stop them. Tonight, we are going to walk through exactly what happened inside that Texas home. We are going to talk about the affair, the poison, the plan, and the moment Sarah figured it out. Because the way she figured it out, quietly, methodically, without tipping her hand once, is the part of this story that nobody talks about enough. She didn't scream. She didn't confront. She built a case. And then she made her move. Before we go any further into this story, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment right now and tell us where in the world you are watching from tonight. We have viewers joining us from all across the United States, from Canada, from Australia, from places we never expected, and every single comment reminds us why we do this work. And if you have not subscribed to this channel yet, please do it right now. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos, because the stories we are bringing you are only getting bigger, and you do not want to be the last person to find out what happened. Now, let us go back to the beginning, because to truly understand what Sarah was up against, you have to understand who Sarah was before any of this started. You have to understand the kind of woman she was, what she had built, and why 2 people who had watched her life from the outside decided that they wanted it more than she deserved to keep it. Sarah grew up in a working-class household in the kind of American town where the expectations for women were kept deliberately low and the opportunities were kept deliberately limited. Her family was not poor in the way that makes headlines, but they were the kind of family where money was always a source of tension, where the end of every month came with a quiet anxiety that nobody talked about out loud, but everybody felt. Sarah felt it from the time she was old enough to understand what a bill was. And instead of accepting that as the ceiling of her life, she decided, somewhere around the age of 15, sitting at a kitchen table watching her mother count out dollars, that she was going to build something different. Not because anyone told her she could, because nobody told her she couldn't loudly enough to make her believe it. She worked through high school. She put herself through 2 years of community college while working evenings at a grocery store, saved enough to transfer to a 4-year university, and graduated with a business degree that she had paid for herself, dollar by dollar, decision by decision. When her classmates were spending their early 20s figuring out who they were, Sarah was already figuring out how to build something permanent. She got her real estate license at 24. By 27, she had flipped her first property. By 30, she owned 3. The house she lived in, a 4-bedroom home in a quiet Texas suburb with a backyard and a kitchen she had renovated herself, was purchased in her name, with her money, built on a foundation of 15 years of choices that other people her age were not willing to make. She also had Rose. And Rose, to Sarah, was the single best decision she had ever made. Rose was 7 years old when this story begins, bright, stubborn, full of noise and energy, and the particular kind of confidence that little girls develop when they are raised by mothers who refuse to apologize for taking up space. Rose called her mother Mom, with the kind of absolute certainty that only children have, the certainty that says you are the most reliable thing in my world. Sarah kept that in mind during every hard month, every late night, every morning she got up before sunrise to handle something that nobody else was going to handle. Rose was the reason. Rose was always the reason. And then there was Jake. Jake came into Sarah's life the way that certain men always do, with potential that looked, from a distance, like it was on the verge of becoming something real. He was good-looking in the way that reads as confidence before you have known someone long enough to understand the difference between confidence and performance. He talked about the future with a certainty that felt magnetic. He had plans. He had ambitions. He had the particular charm of a man who knows how to make a woman feel like she is the one who finally sees him clearly, the one who finally believes in him the way he deserves to be believed in. Sarah believed in him. She chose him. They married in a ceremony that she largely organized and largely paid for, which she told herself was simply because she was better at those things, which was true, though the more accurate truth was that Jake was simply not willing to do the work. 3 years into their marriage, the distance between what Jake had promised and what Jake had delivered was large enough that Sarah could no longer pretend she didn't notice it. He had held 4 different jobs in 3 years, none for longer than 8 months, all of them ending in circumstances that Jake always described as someone else's fault. He had contributed to the household finances sporadically and inconsistently, in amounts that never came close to covering his share of anything. He had never once paid a bill proactively, only reactively, and only when Sarah had already handled it herself and pointed out that she had. He was not a violent man. He was not a cruel man in the ways that are obvious or easy to name. He was something more insidious than that. He was a man who had decided, somewhere early in his life, that the world owed him a comfortable existence, and that the most efficient way to access that existence was to position himself next to a woman who was willing to build it. What Sarah did not fully see, or would not fully let herself see, was the resentment underneath the charm. Jake did not just fail to provide. He resented that she could. He resented that when people talked about their household, they talked about Sarah's career, Sarah's investments, Sarah's house. He resented that Rose looked to Sarah for everything in the way that children look to the parent who has actually been present and consistent. He resented that his name was on nothing of real consequence in their shared life because nothing of real consequence had been built by him. That resentment sat in him quietly, the way water sits in walls, invisible until the damage is already done. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon in March, Sarah's cousin Clara called from across the state and said she needed help. She had lost her apartment. Her relationship had ended. She had nowhere to go. Could she come stay with them, just for a little while, just until she got back on her feet? Sarah did not hesitate. She said yes. She said come. She said the guest room is ready. Because that is who Sarah was. She was the person in the family who solved problems, who opened doors, who absorbed the weight of other people's crises without complaint, because it had simply never occurred to her not to. Clara arrived on a Friday evening in late March with 2 suitcases, a pleasant expression, and something underneath that expression that Sarah, in her generosity, did not examine closely enough. The 2 women had grown up in the same extended family, but had never been truly close in the way that geography sometimes forces a closeness that personality never quite confirms. They had attended the same family events, shared some of the same memories, exchanged the pleasantries of people who are connected by blood, but not by genuine intimacy. What Sarah did not know, what she could not have known, because Clara had never said it out loud, was that Clara had been watching her cousin's life for years with a feeling that had nothing to do with happiness for her. Clara had watched every milestone Sarah posted, every photo of the house, every update about the career and the investments and the beautiful, noisy, confident little girl named Rose. And every time she saw it, the thing that rose in her was not pride in her cousin's achievements. It was the slow, calcifying certainty that what Sarah had should have been hers, that the life Sarah had built had somehow been assembled from materials that rightfully belonged to Clara. It made no logical sense, but jealousy rarely does. Clara had been in the house exactly 2 weeks when Sarah first noticed that something in the atmosphere of her own home had shifted. She could not have named it precisely at the time, the way you often cannot name the exact moment a room gets darker because the light changes so gradually. But she felt it. Jake was more animated than he had been in months. He smiled more. He laughed at things that were not that funny, with his whole face, which was something Sarah had not seen from him in a very long time. He found reasons to be in rooms where Clara was. He volunteered for errands that involved Clara's schedule. He stayed up later than usual, long after Sarah had gone to bed, and when she asked him the next morning what he had been doing, his answers were always slightly too casual, slightly too quick, in the way that only sounds like nothing when you have not yet started listening carefully. The affair did not begin as an earthquake. It began the way most betrayals begin, as a series of small decisions, each one individually deniable, each one easily explained away, accumulating over days and then weeks into something that had its own momentum and its own gravity. A conversation that lasted too long after midnight. A hand that rested somewhere it had no reason to be. A look that was held for a beat past what familiarity would allow. They were not careful because neither of them believed they needed to be. Jake's arrogance had always been the belief that he was too smooth to get caught. Clara's was the belief that she was too clever to leave evidence. Together, those two arrogances produced a confidence that was completely untethered from the reality of who Sarah was and what she was capable of noticing when she finally decided to pay attention. But they had also decided that confidence was not enough. Because an affair, on its own, did not get them what they wanted. What they wanted was not just each other. What they wanted was the house, the savings accounts, the investment portfolio Sarah had spent 15 years building, the financial security that she had constructed from nothing through discipline and sacrifice, and the kind of long-term thinking that neither Jake nor Clara had ever been willing to apply to their own lives. They wanted it all, and there was only one obstacle standing between them and all of it: Sarah and Rose. Because Rose, as Jake's daughter, would be entitled to a portion of anything that passed through the estate, which meant that Rose, too, had to be dealt with. The plan they arrived at was not impulsive. That is the part that is hardest to absorb when you hear it. They did not decide in a moment of rage or desperation. They thought it through. They were patient. They chose a method that was slow and incremental and difficult to detect, a method that real cases across the United States have shown us, again and again, is chosen by people who understand that sudden, dramatic deaths raise immediate questions, while slow deteriorations are explained away as illness, as stress, as bad luck. A substance added to Sarah's coffee every morning. A small amount to Rose's juice. Not enough to kill quickly. Enough to erode. Enough that over weeks and months, what began as unexplained fatigue and headaches would become something progressively worse, something that doctors might eventually attribute to any number of causes, something that would give two people plenty of time to position themselves for what came next. The first weeks of the poisoning passed without drama, which is exactly what the method was designed to produce. Sarah was tired. But Sarah was always tired. She was a working mother running a household and managing a career and carrying the financial weight of a family that included a man who contributed almost nothing. Fatigue was her baseline. She drank her coffee and went to work and came home and made dinner and got Rose ready for bed and went to sleep and got up and did it again. She did not think about the coffee. She had no reason to. Week 3 brought the first real sign, though Sarah did not recognize it as a sign at the time. Rose came home from school on a Wednesday complaining of a headache, went to bed early, and woke up the next morning still feeling off. The pediatrician's office said it sounded like a mild virus, maybe the beginning of allergy season, rest and fluids, and check back if it persists. Sarah gave Rose children's pain reliever and kept her home for a day and watched her bounce back by the weekend, and that was that. She did not connect Rose's headache to anything in their home. Why would she? There were 2 other people living in that house eating and drinking the same things, and both of them were perfectly fine. Because both of them were perfectly fine, because they were not drinking from Sarah's mug or Rose's glass, which was the point. Week 6 brought Sarah her first dizzy spell at work. She was standing in a meeting, a presentation she had helped prepare, in a conference room she had been in dozens of times, and the room tilted slightly, the way a room tilts when you stand up too fast, except that she had not stood up fast. She sat down. Her colleague across the table asked if she was okay. She said yes. She said she hadn't eaten enough that morning. She drank a glass of water and finished the meeting. She drove home. She took a multivitamin and went to bed early and told herself she was simply burning the candle at both ends, which was something she had always done and which had never made her dizzy before, but which she was willing to accept as an explanation because the alternative explanations were not ones she was ready to entertain. Week 8. Rose was in the emergency room. It started as another headache, worse than the ones before, and then nausea that would not settle, and then Rose was crying in a way that was not her regular crying. Not the crying of a child who is frustrated or tired or hurt, but the crying of a child who feels genuinely wrong inside her own body and cannot explain why. Sarah drove her to urgent care, which escalated to the emergency room when the triage nurse looked at Rose's presentation and decided this warranted more than a waiting room and a Tylenol. They ran blood work. They ran vitals. They found elevated markers, not dramatically elevated, not the kind of numbers that produce immediate alarm and a referral to a specialist, but elevated enough to note, elevated enough to put in the chart, elevated enough that the attending physician said he wanted to follow up in 2 weeks and asked Sarah if anything had changed in Rose's diet or environment recently. Sarah said no. She believed it when she said it. But she sat in the plastic chair beside Rose's hospital bed, under the fluorescent lights, in the particular silence of an emergency room after midnight, and she felt something move through her that she had not felt before. It was not fear exactly, though fear was part of it. It was not grief, though something that resembled grief was present. It was older than both of those things and more specific. It was the feeling of a warning. The feeling of something inside you that knows before your conscious mind is prepared to know, that speaks in the language of instinct rather than the language of reasoning. She pushed it down. She focused on Rose. She held her daughter's hand and watched her sleep under the hospital lights and told herself that children get sick, that the world is full of benign explanations, that she was not the kind of woman who catastrophized. She drove home that night at 2 a.m. and sat in her car in the driveway for 20 minutes before going inside. The lights in the living room were still on. Through the window, she could see the television flickering blue. She could see Jake and Clara on the couch, close together, and she could hear, even through the glass, even at that hour, the easy sound of their laughter. There was nothing strained in it. There was nothing guilty in it. That was what struck her, the absolute ease of it. 2 people laughing in the living room while her daughter had just spent 3 hours in an emergency room and nobody had called to ask how Rose was. She did not go inside angry. She had not yet reached anger. She went inside quiet, said goodnight to 2 people who turned and smiled at her with expressions that showed no trace of anything she could name, and she went to bed. But she did not sleep. She lay in the dark and she thought. And the thought she had been refusing to allow, the thought she had been insisting was catastrophizing, was paranoia, was the product of exhaustion, arrived and sat down with her and would not leave. What if this is not happening to us? What if this is being done to us? And more specifically, terrifyingly, specifically, by whom? She did not confront anyone the next morning. She did not change anything visible about her routine. She got up at the same time. She made the coffee. She poured the cream. She set the mugs on the counter in the same positions they had always occupied. She smiled at Jake. She smiled at Clara. She took Rose to school. And then she drove to an office supply store and bought a narrow, hardcover notebook, and she began to write everything down. The notebook was not a journal. Sarah was not writing her feelings. She was documenting. She went back through her memory as far as she could reliably reach, and she wrote down every symptom she could recall, hers and Rose's both, with the best approximation of dates she could reconstruct and the circumstances surrounding each one. What she had eaten, what she had drunk, how much time had passed between the morning and the onset of the symptom. She filled 3 pages the first night. She filled 6 more over the following week. And when she laid them all out on her kitchen table late one Sunday evening, when Jake and Clara were both out of the house, the pattern was so consistent, so linear, so impossible to attribute to coincidence, that she sat with it for a very long time without moving. Every significant episode in her documented memory had occurred within hours of the morning routine. Every single one. On the mornings, she had skipped coffee 3 times in the past 6 months. Twice because she had been running late and once because the coffee maker had been acting up. Her symptoms that day had been notably lighter or absent. Rose's worst episodes had all followed mornings when Rose had finished her juice quickly, which was what Rose always did when the juice was slightly sweeter than usual, which Sarah had noted twice in the past months and attributed to a different brand. She had not thought about it at the time. She was thinking about it now. She started varying the routine without announcing it. She would make the coffee, pour her mug, take it to her bathroom while getting ready, and pour it down the sink. She would refill the mug with water from the tap and carry that to the kitchen. Some mornings, she left early and grabbed breakfast from a cafe near her office. She also, quietly and with no explanation, shifted Rose's morning routine. A new breakfast that Rose was told was a health initiative. Juice replaced with milk that Sarah poured herself from a carton she bought separately and kept in a small cooler in her own closet. Rose, who was 7 and adaptable and trusted her mother completely, accepted this without complaint. Her symptoms improved within 10 days. Rose stopped having headaches. Sarah called Tom on a Thursday evening. She called him from her car, parked 2 streets away from her house, engine running. Tom had been her friend since childhood, the kind of friend who occupies a particular category that defies easy description, the person who has known you long enough to hear what you are not saying. She did not tell him everything. She told him she needed a resource she could trust and could not source through anyone connected to her current life. She asked if he knew anyone who ran private toxicology panels, the kind that did not go through insurance, the kind that did not require a referral, the kind that produced results in 10 days without generating a paper trail that ran through her primary physician's office. Tom did not ask why. He did not press for an explanation she was not ready to give. He said he would call her back. He called her back in 18 hours with a name and a number. The private panel came back 11 days later. The results were specific. There was a substance in her system consistent with a category of compounds used in slow-acting poisoning, identifiable, with a chemical signature that was not produced by anything in a normal diet or common over-the-counter medication. Not conclusive by itself, because nothing is ever conclusive by itself, but specific enough, documented. The kind of finding that, combined with the right evidence, becomes the foundation of something solid. She ordered the camera on a Friday night. It was a small device, the kind that is sold legally and openly for home security purposes, the kind that looks exactly like an ordinary household object and records everything within its range in high definition. She installed it on a Tuesday morning while Jake was at an appointment he had mentioned the night before and Clara was in the shower. She positioned it on the shelf above the coffee station, calibrated it, confirmed the angle covered the full counter surface from the mugs to the coffee maker, and then went to work. She did not tell anyone it was there. She did not tell Tom. She did not tell her attorney, not yet. She simply came home that evening, smiled at Jake and Clara, made dinner, helped Rose with her homework, and went to bed. 3 mornings passed. Nothing was captured that was specifically actionable. The camera showed the kitchen. It showed people moving through the kitchen. It showed the coffee being made. But it did not yet show what she was waiting for. She was patient. People who have been carrying everyone else's weight for their entire adult lives understand patience in a way that other people do not. She waited. On the 4th morning, at 6:14 in the morning, 11 minutes before Jake typically came downstairs and 23 minutes before Sarah would normally appear in the kitchen, Clara came down alone. The camera recorded everything. Clara stood at the coffee station. She looked toward the hallway entrance. The look lasted 2 full seconds. The particular, specific look of someone checking to confirm they are unobserved. Then she reached into the pocket of her robe and removed a small container. She added a measured amount of its contents to the mug on the left. Sarah's mug, which had occupied the same position on that same counter for every morning of the 3 years they had lived in that house. Then Clara put the container back in her pocket, moved to the refrigerator, opened it, and stood there for a moment as if deciding what to have for breakfast, as if that were the only reason she had come downstairs. Then she closed the refrigerator, went to the window, looked at the backyard, and waited for the household to wake up. Sarah watched that footage on her phone, alone in her car, parked in the lot of a grocery store 6 blocks from the house. She watched it once all the way through. Then she rewound it and watched it again. Then a 3rd time. On the 3rd viewing, she paused it on the moment Clara's hand came out of the pocket. She sat with that frame for a long time. Then she put the phone face down on the passenger seat and looked out the windshield at the parking lot and the strip mall beyond it and the pale morning sky above all of it. She did not cry. She did not feel what she might have expected to feel. What she felt was something remarkably close to clarity. The absence of uncertainty. The floor finally under her feet after months of reaching for it in the dark. She called her attorney from that parking lot. She was composed. She explained what she had documented, what the toxicology panel had found, and what the camera had captured. She asked what the next steps were. Her attorney told her to come in that afternoon and to bring everything. She said she would. She drove to work. She went through her entire day without telling a single colleague, without adjusting her expression, without giving Jake or Clara any indication, that evening, that anything was different. She made dinner. She asked about Clara's day. She helped Jake find something he had misplaced. She got Rose ready for bed and read her 2 chapters of the book they were working through together and kissed her daughter goodnight. And then she went to her home office and spent 2 hours organizing the documentation her attorney had asked for. The symptom log, the toxicology results, the camera footage clipped and timestamped, the hospital records for Rose, the pattern she had mapped across 6 months of a morning routine that had been used against her and her daughter by people she had welcomed into her home. In the days that followed, Sarah moved quietly and with precision through a series of steps that her attorney helped choreograph. Her financial accounts were restructured to limit unauthorized access. The investment portfolio was reviewed by her financial advisor under the framework of a routine annual audit. Every piece of property documentation she owned was pulled, reviewed, and updated. She also, quietly and without comment, sent Rose to stay with a trusted aunt in another city. A visit she framed to Jake and Clara as a spontaneous extended playdate, a few days at a cousin's house. Jake nodded when she told him. He did not ask when Rose was coming back. He did not ask to call Rose that evening to say goodnight. He did not, in any moment during the days Rose was away, ask about his daughter in any way that suggested he had noticed she was gone. Sarah registered that. She added it to what she already knew. She walked into the police station on a Tuesday morning with a folder that her attorney had organized in a demeanor so composed that the detective who received her later described her presentation as one of the most methodical he had encountered from a civilian. She had the camera footage on a drive. She had the time-stamped symptom log printed in chronological order. She had the private toxicology report. She had Rose's emergency room records. She had a cover letter her attorney had drafted that laid out the pattern, the evidence, and the legal theory in 7 concise paragraphs. The detective reviewed it in silence for several minutes. He asked 3 clarifying questions. She answered them precisely and without elaboration. He told her they would be in contact within 48 hours. She thanked him, stood up, and left. She drove to a coffee shop she had never been to before, on a street she did not normally take, ordered something she watched a barista make from scratch in front of her, and sat by the window for 45 minutes. Drinking coffee that nobody had touched, watching the street, breathing. The arrest came on a Thursday morning. It was coordinated, which is the word law enforcement uses when they mean simultaneous, meaning Jake and Clara were taken into custody within minutes of each other at the house, before either of them had the opportunity to speak to the other, to align their stories, to decide together what version of events they were going to present. Clara was in the kitchen when they arrived. Jake was upstairs. Neither of them had any idea it was coming, because Sarah had given them no indication. She had made the coffee that morning. She had set the mugs in their usual positions. She had sat at the kitchen table and watched the steam rise from her own glass of water and waited, quietly, for the knock at the door that she knew was coming. Clara did not cry when the handcuffs went on. She looked at Sarah, across the kitchen, across the distance of everything that had happened in that house. And the look on her face carried nothing that resembled remorse, nothing that resembled surprise, nothing that resembled the expression of someone who is confronting the consequences of a terrible mistake. What it carried was the flat, specific recognition of someone who has been calculating and has now lost the calculation. That was all. Then she looked away. She did not look at Sarah again. Jake's reaction was different. Jake talked. Jake explained. Jake reframed. He told the officers that Sarah had misunderstood the situation. He said things that, in the context of what was documented in that folder, sounded less like explanations and more like a man who had not yet understood how completely the evidence had already answered every question he was attempting to raise. The officer's response to Jake's account, as later recorded in the official notes, was 4 words: "We have it documented." Jake stopped talking. The charges filed against both of them were serious, specific, and fully supported by the evidence Sarah had spent 3 months quietly assembling. Conspiracy to commit murder, aggravated assault, attempted poisoning, fraud. Both were held without bail pending trial given the documented premeditation. This was not a crime of passion, not a spontaneous act, not something that could be framed as a misunderstanding or a moment of poor judgment. This was a plan, weeks of it, careful and deliberate, and aimed at a woman and a 7-year-old child. The court understood what it was looking at. Sarah stood outside her house that morning, the house she had bought, furnished, maintained, renovated, and loved, and watched the last vehicle pull away from the curb. The Texas sun was coming up over the roofline the way it always did, orange and unhurried, indifferent to the drama of human beings in the way that only the natural world can be. She did not celebrate. She did not collapse. She did not perform any of the emotions that the moment might seem to require. She stood there for a while, and then she exhaled, slowly, from somewhere deeper than her lungs, in the particular way of someone who has been holding their breath without fully realizing it for 6 months. But the story was not finished. Because in the course of the investigation, in the process of law enforcement examining the full scope of what Jake and Clara had been planning, something emerged that had not been part of the original case. Something that landed differently than all of it. Something that reframed the story at the exact moment you thought you had already understood it completely. Jake had been preparing documents. Not with Clara. Separately, through a contact his attorney later identified. Documents intended to legally challenge his paternity of Rose. He had been in preliminary communications about establishing a formal denial, a legal declaration that would have removed Rose from any claim on his estate or any financial obligation on his part, pending the conclusion of whatever was going to happen to Sarah. He had never planned to be a father to that little girl in the aftermath of any of this. He had not just planned to take Sarah's life and her assets. He had planned to erase his own daughter from the legal record of his existence before her mother was even cold. Rose called him Daddy. She had always called him Daddy. She had drawn him pictures that were still on the refrigerator the morning the police came. And he had been drafting paperwork to make her disappear from his life before she was old enough to understand what disappearing meant. That is the detail that tells you everything you need to know about who Jake was. Not the affair. Not the conspiracy. Not even the poisoning. The paperwork. The cold, administrative decision to look at a 7-year-old child, his child, and begin the process of making her legally not his problem. That is who was sitting at Sarah's table every morning, eating food she cooked, drinking coffee she made, inhabiting a life she had built. That is what was underneath the charm and the potential and the man she had believed in for 3 years and loved before that. Both Jake and Clara went to trial. The evidence Sarah had assembled was presented to a jury that did not take long to understand what they were looking at. Both were convicted. Both were sentenced to terms that reflected the premeditated nature of what they had attempted, the years of planning, the methodical approach, the fact that a child had been included as a target. The legal system, given the documentation Sarah had provided, did not have much room to move toward anything lighter. They had tried to kill a mother and her daughter for money and for jealousy. A jury of 12 people from the same state that Sarah had built her life in understood exactly what that was. The divorce was finalized without significant complication. Sarah's attorney had protected her financial assets so thoroughly in the weeks before the arrest that there was nothing left to meaningfully contest. The house remained hers. The accounts remained hers. The investments remained hers. Every single thing she had spent 15 years building remained exactly where she had placed it, because she had been smart enough and composed enough and precise enough to secure it before the people who had tried to take it were in a position to reach for it. Rose recovered fully. Children carry a resilience that adults have usually had educated out of them by the time they are old enough to need it most, and Rose was no exception. She came home from her aunt's house with the same noise and movement that had always defined her. Filling every room, she entered the way she always had, asking for pancakes for dinner and objecting loudly to bedtime, and leaving her shoes in the exact middle of the hallway where Sarah would always trip over them. Sarah let her. Sarah stood in the hallway in the dark one night, one shoe in her hand, and laughed until her eyes were wet. Because the shoes in the hallway meant Rose was there. Rose was fine. Rose was home. Tom was there throughout all of it. He had been there in the quiet, steady way of someone who understands that showing up is not about announcements. It is about presence. He had found the toxicologist. He had answered calls at odd hours. He had not asked for explanations beyond what Sarah was ready to offer. After the trials were over and the paperwork was signed and the last chapter of everything that had happened had been formally closed, Sarah and Tom began spending time together in the way that feels less like a beginning and more like a continuation, the resumption of something that was always going to find its way to the surface eventually, if given enough time and the right circumstances. He was successful in a way that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with the actual discipline of building something over time. He was kind in a way that showed up in small moments rather than grand gestures. He was proud of Sarah in a way that Jake never once had been. Proud of her strength, proud of her precision, proud of the fact that she had walked through something designed to destroy her and had come out the other side with everything intact. Rose, for the first several months, called Tom by his first name. She was 7 and perceptive and did not rush anything. Then one afternoon, without any conversation about it, without anyone asking or suggesting or nudging, she stopped using his first name and started using something else. Sarah heard it for the first time from the other room and stood very still for a moment, the kind of still that only certain moments produce. Then she went back to what she was doing. There is a version of this story that asks you to focus on the betrayal, on the affair, on the poison, on the premeditation, on the paperwork Jake was preparing to erase his own daughter. And those things are real and they matter and they should be named clearly and held up to the light so that everyone who hears this story understands exactly what they represent. But there is another version of this story, the one that sits underneath all of that. And it is the story of what it actually means to build something. Sarah did not just build a house and a portfolio and a career. She built the capacity to survive. She built the habit of paying attention. She built the discipline of documentation and the precision of action and the composure to execute a plan in the middle of a crisis without letting anyone see her hands shake. She built all of that long before she knew she was going to need it. That is what building something actually looks like, not just the thing you can point to and name, but the person you become in the process of making it. She was betrayed because she was generous, not because she was naive, not because she was weak, not because she missed something obvious. She extended trust to people who used that trust as a weapon, and when she understood what was happening, she handled it with a precision that most people, most investigators, most attorneys, most anyone who later heard the details of what she assembled in those 3 months, found remarkable. She did not wait to be saved. She saved herself, and then she lived the life she had always been building toward, in a house that was hers, with a daughter who was thriving, and a man who understood what it meant to be next to someone like Sarah and considered it the most fortunate thing that had ever happened to him. And that is where we leave her. Shoes in the hallway. Coffee she made herself. A table that belongs to her. A morning that is entirely, completely, undeniably hers. Before we close tonight, we want to ask you something that we genuinely want you to answer in the comments below. At what point in this story would you have started to suspect something? Be honest. Because what this story teaches us, what the real cases behind it have taught investigators and prosecutors and families across this country for decades, is that slow harm inside a trusted relationship is the hardest kind to see. Not because the signs aren't there, but because trust is a form of vision, and love is a form of blindness, and the two things live in the same house and eat at the same table, and it takes something specific, a child in a hospital bed, a laugh through a window at 2 in the morning, to make you look at what you have been choosing not to see. We want to know. Drop your answer below. And while you're there, tell us where you are watching from tonight. We read every single comment. We see every one of you. And if you have not subscribed to this channel, please do it right now. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because the next story we are bringing you is one that will reach you in ways you did not expect. We will see you there.